Now, you're Betty Pettit, and
Yeah.
you have been the nurse here for...
Yeah, I was district nurse, midwife and health visitor. I thought actually to begin this I would tell you what it was like when I first came, because it includes the village and the conditions and everything else. And the first thing to know is that before I took the job, which was in 1955, you may have seen the plaque outside the house, forget about it, the date is wrong and I'll tell you about that in a minute. They had only had a trained midwife here and not a trained nurse, although she had done district nursing. And the other thing to remember is that when I came in 1955, the National Health Service was still comparatively young. And previous to that, all these villages had their own nursing associations. And they used to pay twopence and threepence a week or something like that, so that they could have a nurse in when they either had their babies or when they were ill. So they were still not used to the idea that the National Health Service was free. So I had to overcome the surprise at being asked how much I was going to charge for my visits. So going back to me, I took the job because my mother had died and my father was left on his own, and because of a lot of problems with the house, I needed a job that where I was going to have a house, at least to tide things over. And the idea was that I took the job to tide things over till we got ourselves organised and we could sort out housing problems between him and I, because he was going to live with me anyway. So we first came here on the bus, and Baker's Arms Green had a pub on it then. So we got off the bus. We didn't know that we were in Ludham, because we didn't know it. And we went into the little corner shop, which isn't there now, but was named Sparrows. What's her name? Can't remember her name. But that was a little sweetie shop. And there was a girl in it called Pam, and I said to her, could you tell me where School Road is? And she said, oh, I can tell you where the school is. So we said, well, where's the school? And we followed the directions up the road to find the school. Now, the village was totally different, totally different. As you probably know, there was a three-storied house in the middle of the street, and then there were cottages. There was a very small garage, which wasn't much more than a glorified enlarged shed, and there was a house next door where the petrol pumps are now, and the old cottages on the right hand side. There were still people living in there. They were nice little cottages. I was sorry when they went. So we walked down the road and we hadn't got an idea where we'd coming to, and where this house is now was space. It was bare, because this is actually built on what was originally apparently part of the airfield. And I think Mike Fuller, or one of the men that have lived in the village all their lives, will probably tell you that it is. And they all tell me different stories, but I think it was either the naffy or the mess or something like that. But it was a total space. Anyway, so we got organised and I started. And my first baby was, and she won't mind me telling you because she's very proud of the fact, was a lady called Enid Abbs, who lived down at the bottom of Sharp Street, past where Dr. Jarvis lives, between his house and the farm, in that pretty little cottage down there called Cobb Cottage. She was in her 30s, she'd been married 11 years, and this was a very, very much wanted baby. So off I toddled on my bike to this case, and it was September, and she was frightened of thunderstorms. And in the middle of the night we had the most horrendous thunderstorm. But anyway, we soldiered on, and eventually I sent for a doctor. Now, I was down at the bottom of Sharp Street and nobody had a telephone, so I had to send Grandad on his bike up to Elderbush Lane to ring for the telephone, to ring the doctor to say I was there. And she had to have quite a bad forceps delivery. But I'd been used to trolleys with glass tops. What did I have to have but a stool with a newspaper and a towel on top of it? Anyway, we had this baby. It was all very nice and all very well. And I came home about lunchtime and met my father pacing up and down the road. And I said, "What on earth are you doing?" He said, "Well, I was worried. I didn't know where you were." So I said, "Well, I told you. Would you have been any the wiser?" He said, "No." So I said, "Well, get indoors and don't ever do that again." Bless his heart, he didn't ever. He used to say that he trusted me, which was, you know, a big deal. We actually had, I was going to say a little bit more about the general conditions. The surgery was non-existent. We didn't have a surgery at that precise moment. They were either beginning to build it or thinking about building the one on the side of Staithe House. It's there now, but I don't know what it's used for now. And we had Dr. Wilson as the doctor, and very soon after Dr. Geoffrey Bolt came, and he lived in a flat in Ingham Hall. But they had no receptionist, no pharmacist, nothing like that. And the people at that time used to go and sit outside the house, and he had his surgery in his dining room. I always liked Dr. Wilson. A lot of people didn't like him, but he, to me, was a gentleman. But they'd had, remembering that they'd never had a trained nurse, so they were a bit wary of me. They'd never had an up-to-date trained midwife who had got the use of drugs, who'd got the use of gas and air machines. He used to go in with an anaesthetic which he used to give him, which in my eyes was deadly dangerous. I used to call it jungle midwifery. And they had no antenatal clinic. They used to go to the doctor and say, "Please, sir, I'm pregnant," and he'd say, "Oh yes, now then, when do you think you're due?" And he'd note it down. He'd say, "Come and see me," and he'd see them once or twice during pregnancy, and that was it. And I'd been used to sophisticated antenatal clinics with blood tests and x-rays and all the rest of it. So I trained him and we started an antenatal clinic, not sophisticated as that. But in all the years I was here, we were very, very careful who we picked to have their babies at home. At that time, very few went into hospital, but we did sort them out if necessary and say, "Look, you have got to have your baby in hospital." And we didn't have any tragedies that I remember in all the years that I did the midwifery. We had unfortunate cases which couldn't have been foretold. Might have done now in 2000, but it certainly wasn't able to foretell them then. So we started the antenatal clinics. We didn't have any form of clinics like immunisations and things like that. So we started those and we got those organised. And he was ever so amenable. He used to fall in and say, "Oh, well, yes, okay, all right, you start it, we'll do it." And we got it on it very well. And we worked in very strict boundaries. Now, my boundary was Ludham, Catfield and Potterham when I first started. And woe betide me if I went over the boundary because of the nurse in the next area. But the doctors didn't have any boundaries. And we had doctors from all over the county coming into the village. There were 2 at Wroxham that would come in. There was one from Flegborough. There was one from Stalham. There was one from Smallborough. There was one from Martham. And I forget anymore, but there was 6 or 7 doctors. And they all wanted things done their way. And they all had different ideas. For instance, one wanted to be called when somebody went into labour. Somebody else didn't want to be called till it was nearly ready for delivery. Someone wanted me to use one sort of drug. Somebody wanted me to use another. Somebody wanted me to get them up on such and such a day. And somebody wanted me to get them up on some other different day. So it was all... And I think I used to think, stuff them all and do what I wanted and just hope they didn't find out. And the girls... But you know, it was all new to them because they'd never had it. And certainly when I arrived with a gas and air machine, I think they thought I was a witch coming out with this magic thing that, you know, they'd been given a rope to pull on, full stop, and that was all they had until he arrived with his anaesthetic. So it was all very, very new to them and to me, but I must admit that I didn't ever meet what I would really call opposition. They really did accept me for what I was. And I did get a name for speaking my mind, but I had to in the beginning because people had to accept me as I was because there wasn't anything else to fall back on. So what happened if somebody wanted me when I was out? We had to have a board with a piece of chalk in the window, and you had to put right on the board where you were going and at what time you were expected, and if there was a telephone, a number. And the local policeman in every village then had its own policeman, used to have to bike down, look at my window, find out where I was, and make sure that somebody called me and told me where to go. It didn't happen too often because I used to say, particularly to mothers whose babies were about due, now look, even if you're in doubt, let me know before I go out, then I can come and see you and work my day's work in with you. It's hopeless if I'm down at Thurn to expect a bobby to come down on his bicycle to fetch me. So we did get it, but that was the rule. And they used to inspect our boards when they came round to make sure that we kept them properly. But the telephones were really funny. St Catherine's Avenue at Catfield, the council estate, was built mainly to take squatters off the airfield. I don't know whether you know about them, but the airfield, the old buildings that presumably the men lived in, were taken over by squatters when the airfields closed down, and they had to be rehoused. So Smallborough district, as it was then, built all these houses at Catfield. So they were a multi-crowd. I mean, they came from all over the place. And they had babies like nobody's on earth. At one stage, I had 50 babies under 5 on that, or 50 children under 5 on that estate. But the Catfield Crown telephone was always used, you see. And half the time, they didn't know how to use a telephone, so it was a case of getting through to the operator. And one night, I used to get messages like, she started, can you come? Where do you start? You start at St Catherine's Avenue because it was likely to be one of them. And you went round the estate and looked for a light. When you saw a light, you went, is that the house where so-and-so lives? Yes, it must be. So you'd go and knock at the door and say, are you waiting for him? Yes, you're taking a long time. Well, yes, but you didn't tell me. And then one night, well, I laughed so much, my telephone rang and a voice said, come on! And down went the receiver. I hadn't got a clue. So I picked the phone up, rang because they were all on their own exchanges, rang the operator and said, have you any idea where that telephone call to me came from? She said, Catfield Crown. So all I did was go down to Catfield Crown and St Catherine's Avenue and have a wander around till I found a light on. I found the one that was waiting for me. Obviously, we had electricity, running water and a bathroom. But not many other places in the village had it. There was the council bungalows next door to that was, obviously, and there was 2 or 3 built in School Close, but School Close wasn't anything like it is now, and it certainly didn't go down to the grouped homes. They were built much later. And Whitegates, and Laurel Crescent and Whitegates. Laurel Crescent, I think, had water. I don't remember wells, but Whitegates were all on wells. And most of the privately owned cottages in the village, or farm cottages, be it what they were, all had wells. Very, very few wells, and I think there was only 1 or 2 in the whole of my area, were fit for a baby under 6 months to be given the water. They had had the fertiliser from the land seep into them, which produced, if the baby took it under 6 months old, it did something to their blood and it made them go blue. It was called a blue baby syndrome, not to be mixed up with a baby with a heart condition. So again, one of my jobs when a mother booked antenatally was to go up to her house, particularly in Whitegates and some of the cottages, take a bottle of water, an empty bottle with me, fill it with water and take it away, send it away to be tested. And I knew that all the wells in Whitegates were unfit. So what do we do with babies that needed water? Well, you've got tap water, haven't you, nurse? Can we come down and get some of that? So my father had quite a little business going of filling bottles and cans of water. When mothers used to come down, nurse said, we could do it, Mr. Pettit, can you fill my bottle for me? And he'd spend 2 or 3 minutes filling there, and off they used to go quite happily with their bottle of water till the next time. They used to come down every other day. And it must have been into the 60s before Whitegates had water. Laurel Crescent had water, but they certainly didn't have sewage. They had Elson toilets in their houses. They didn't have, they weren't on the sewage system, so we couldn't pull chains there. And Whitegates didn't have electricity, and very few of the cottages had electricity. So I was often delivering a baby with a lamp. So one of the doctor's jobs was to stand at the bottom of the bed and hold the lamp while I delivered the baby, because otherwise I couldn't see. You couldn't get enough light from an oil lamp to see what you were doing. It was so easy when electricity came, so very easy. But it was a time when everybody knew everybody, and they all fell in together and they all worked. And if they saw me at a house, invariably somebody would say, "Are you all right, nurse? Do you want any help?" And you'd say, no, I'm all right, but I'll fetch you if I need you. Or they would come in and say, "Look, I know she hasn't got so-and-so, or I know they haven't got so-and-so, so I brought this for you." And I remember one day going to an elderly gentleman who was in a bed downstairs, and it was a bitterly cold day, and he didn't have sheets on his bed. He wouldn't have sheets on his bed. He had tarpaulins, or as they called them, tilts. And heaven knows his skin must have been as hard as nails, because he didn't have sores or anything. And I said to him, "This house is freezing." "That's all right for me." I said, "Well, it isn't for me. You've got to have some warmth in here." So I went to his next door neighbour and I said, "Do you know he hasn't got a fire?" "I know he hasn't." She said, "Silly old fool." So I said, "Well, I want a fire in there." "Right you are," she said. And with half an hour we had a roaring great fire, and the coals, she brought coals in, and he thought that was, you know, he'd died and gone to heaven. He was warm. He hadn't realised what it was like to be warm. And he loved it. And he didn't. I had a tremendous argument with a clergyman about that old man, because the clergyman came after me and told me that he'd got to be put away and put into hospital. Now, I didn't see, if he was happy sitting in his tilt in his own bed, why he should have to go into hospital and be looked after by nurses in a bed with sheets on it. He liked his tilts, and that was what he wanted to sleep in. And bless his heart, that's where he died. I did get my own way over that, but I was called everything by that clergyman. He didn't stay here long, fortunately. I don't know whether I changed his mind and he moved, because it wasn't in Ludham. He wasn't a Ludham clergyman, so we didn't go back looking at names. But you know, you really did get all the help that you could possibly want, and they might not like their neighbour, but they were willing to help, and they knew when they needed help. The weather was perhaps one of the biggest things in the winter time, because we did have some jolly hard winters. I don't remember the dates of them, but the one in 64 or whatever it was, when all the rivers froze up here, and people were driving cars up the rivers, and I had to go out on maternity cases. And one night I couldn't get my car out of the garage, and the man hadn't been able to use the telephone, so he'd come down here and knock me up. So we walked to Elderbush Lane. We walked over the fields, and we walked through the drifts. He had the gas and air machine, and I had the delivery bag, and we just hoped she didn't do anything till we got there, but she didn't. And in the morning, Dr. Wilson came up when daylight was, and he said, "How did you get here?" I walked. "Well, you're not walking home," he said. So I said, "Well, how am I going to get home?" "My wife has a new car. She can use it and come and fetch you." So his wife came out in her new car, which was 4-wheel drive, and fetched me back. So, you know, we all worked in together, we all did things together, and it was good. But you see, most of them worked on the land when I first came. They were all either living in farm cottages or, I mean, and they used to get paid on a Friday. Well, Friday mornings, they didn't have any money and much to buy food and things with, and I think the average labourer's wages at that time was somewhere between £6 and £9 a week. We get a couple of children, it doesn't give you much left, does it? And there was one dinner, and I always thought one of these days I'm going to have it. There was one woman in particular. You went in on a Friday morning. They used to have a baking session once a week and do a whole lot of baking, and then that used to have to last them all week.
My mum did that.
One of her favourite things for Friday dinner was she used to make a big suet crust and roll it out till it was about 1 inch thick, and then she used to put, if she had it, fat pork, not lean pork, fat pork, onions and potatoes, salt and pepper, roll it up, put it in a saucepan, and that used to boil all morning. And then by the time they took it out, you see, they'd got all the flavour of the fat pork through into the suet roll. They used to love that. She used to make a great bowl of gravy. Used to love that for their dinner. But they really did have a hard life. I mean, one girl I remember driving, because I used to use the old airfield a lot, because I could nip across there and take shortcuts without anybody stopping me. And I met one girl up there one day. She'd got 2 babies in the pram, 2 on the side, and she was picking blackberries. And I said to her, "What on earth are you doing?" So she said, "Picking blackberries, what's it look like?" So I said, "But, you know, that's 5 o'clock. So she said, "Yeah, I know, but I ain't got anything for the little bugger's tea," she said, "so I'm going to take it home, Stuart." She said, "I've got some custard. They can have custard and blackberries and bread and butter for their tea." Now, you couldn't fault it. No, you couldn't fault it.
You can't, can you?
And you know, they were, and so, but they did that sort of thing, you see. They have, whereas they didn't moan and pity because they hadn't got
off
anything.
to social services.
No, that's right. They did it themselves. And they did a lot of things like that. And I remember a woman coming into the village with a child that wouldn't wear shoes or didn't wear shoes. And I had people knocking on my door saying how disgusting it was. And I looked at them and I said, "When was your grandmother born?" "Why?" I said, "Because I bet she didn't wear shoes." And it's just absolutely stopped them in their tracks because they never thought of it that way, you see. I said, not doing her any harm at all. She doesn't go anywhere where she's going to cut her feet or hurt her feet. Well, I saw her the other day, one of them said, I always remember this, eating a dinner. I said, "Oh yes." She said she'd got she'd got a tin of Campbell's tomato soup and some frozen peas, and she was putting the peas in the soup and eating them. So I said, "So?" "What do you mean, so?" I said, "She was having a jolly good meal." And I said, just because it was cold and frozen doesn't mean to say it wasn't doing her any good, because food would have got warm as soon as it hit her mouth anyway. They couldn't understand why I could stand up for them, you know. I did get myself into trouble sometimes with these sort of things, but I just wouldn't have it, you know. I mean, if somebody really was doing something that was really evil, then I'd do something about it. But if people loved their children and they looked after their children, what was wrong in a child running around with no shoes on? What was wrong with her eating frozen peas and tomato soup? I mean, many people nowadays would be grateful for it, wouldn't they?
Yes.
And then mother was miles from the shop. She couldn't get down to the shop. She'd obviously got these and given it to us. Child was hungry. So there we are. But it was, you know, I mean, you see, throwers used to do a delivery twice a week.
That's right.
Tuesdays and
Bill
Thursdays.
used to do most of those.
Yeah, that's right. They used to come out, and Russell used to do his, and he used to go off to work and come back and stand his van outside the gate, have his breakfast, and off he used to go. He used to do the horning area, I think. But Russell was the first person that I spoke to in Ludham properly, because the day we moved in, It was April, it was cold, and I was in that bungalow on my own. I'd come on the bus, and Russell was, they didn't live in that bungalow there now. He must have stopped to bring it, he must have brought his van up and stopped to go in there. One of the previous district nurses.
This is Russell.
Russell.
He delivered for Throwers as well, did he?
That's right, yeah. Fulshire.
Fulshire, right.
And he came across and he knocked at the door and he said, "I know you're here alone, my dear, but have you got something to make a cup of tea with?" And I said that was the kindest thing, you know, anybody could do. And I never forgot Russell for it. And then it was nice when they moved into that bungalow at the back there, because at that time the nurse that had been here previous to the nurse that I took over from lived there, and she wasn't even midwifery trained. So it really was, you know, coming up from her name was Ledsome. Her daughter was a nurse or sister at Norfolk and Norwich. She trained me. But I remember the old lady dying, and I remember her sitting up in bed 2 or 3 days before she died. She said, "You haven't had a half day this week, go and take a child." I said, "You can't do things like that." "Of course you can," she said. And it seems to me that, you know, at sort of latter end they did as they wanted. But it was fun. You can imagine what some of them thought of me. Really and truly, when I come to think of it, I really was a shock to the system.
But would you have survived if you hadn't been that kind of person? Not as easily.
No, I wouldn't, because I mean I was trained well. I did my general nursing at Norfolk and Norwich, and I did my midwifery nursing training at the oldest midwifery school in the world, in London, General Lying In. And we were trained, and you had to do it. And then I stayed on as sister there, you see. And I was training midwives. So I had perfection, was part of my training. And so it wouldn't have gone down if I couldn't have done things as proper. Mind you know, to... I remember Dr. Wilson saying, "Where can I sit?" And I said, "You sit on a stool if you like." It's the only thing I could give him to sit on his first case with me. But, you know, never mind, we got there. Dr. Bolt wasn't so bad, because he'd worked on a whale ship going around the Pacific or wherever they have whales, or the Antarctic or something on the whale ship. So he was used to the rough and ready. I remember David and Diana Gabriel coming the first time I saw them. That was wonderful. They were sitting outside the garage, and Diana was pregnant with Rupert, and her eldest daughter was in the back of the car. And I went into the garage, and Billy Trivett worked in there then. He said, "You don't know who that is, do you?" And I said, "No." He says, "It's a new doctor." So I knew before they actually took up the job, you know. But yeah, I always remember saying Diana was pregnant with Rupert. I think she must have been that pregnancy must have been quite well on too. Everybody worked hard. Everybody, they made their own amusements. We did have a television soon after we came to live here, but it was with it. I suppose it was black and white. But I suppose not many of them in the village had televisions. You know, we were well off. My father just retired, so we spent his retirement money on a television set so we could have... And the villagers were absolutely wonderful with him. I mean, he came and he was a football fanatic, and within days of him being here, he was booked up to have a ride to Norwich to watch City play, and they used to have a time when they used to go off to away games, and he was always included, and he loved it. And my plans were, when I came here, to sort things out, to have a settled job for a year or two, and then to go back to working in a midwifery unit, which is where my heart was. But he was so happy, and he was so settled, bless him, and he was 65, that by the time I got around to thinking about it, he was 70, and I hadn't the heart to uproot him. And he lived till he was 84, and he was as happy here. He really was. Everybody knew him. He used to go and sit up on the outside the post office and So because he was happy, I suppose I was happy. And I never thought of moving when I realised quite how well he was settled. So I was really quite an old stick in the mud.